already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we know there's days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and my God, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and my God, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace.
All right, welcome back, everyone. This week we come to Psalm 34, and this one is interesting because we have a bit of information in the superscription regarding the occasion for it. And as I've mentioned before, traditionally, the superscriptions are later editions. They're not part of the original text, right? There's the original psalm, and then later on, sometimes these things became appended to it along the way. This one is a psalm of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. So this is referring to an incident in 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15 specifically. And it's interesting, as you kind of read through the psalm, if you're like me, you would think, wow, this does not sound like something he would have composed at the time. If you go back and read the historical account, which I'll try to summarize briefly here in a second, you would likely see why, given the circumstances. So as Brother Waycaster suggests here, if this is indeed the occasion for the composition of the psalm, it may well have been, after the fact, as he's had time to reflect upon this particular incident. And I agree with him, that would certainly make a bit more sense to me. This is the second of what are known as the alphabetical psalms. The 25th was the first of those, if you recall, and we'll try to note things like that as we go along. So regarding the historical matter, going back to 1 Samuel 21, for one thing, in the superscription, changed his behavior before Abimelech. Achish is the actual name of the Philistine king before whom David presented himself, and then fled, or was driven away, right? And he fled. He changed his behavior out of fear. Achish. He had been, just prior to that, before a priest named Ahimelech, which is similar to Abimelech. How similar in the original, I'm not entirely sure. But I've seen it suggested, and I forget now, I looked this up the week before last, if it's Abimelech or Achish, one of the two, is suggested by some to be a generic name for a king. Again, which of the two I don't recall, but similar to Pharaoh. Right, Pharaoh is not a proper name; rather, it's a title. So anyway, if you go back to 1 Samuel, you're going to see that he changes his behavior before Achish, the Philistine king in Gath. So just prior to that, so he's on the run from Saul, right? As is so often the case. David is running from Saul. He comes to Nob, where Abimelech the priest is. Amongst other priestly functionaries, fellow Levites, he lies about why he's there. He tells Ahimelech that he's there because he's been sent on a mission by the king, and he's hungry. He needs food. Right? I'm doing the king's work, referring to Saul. I'm doing the king's work. I need bread. Where's bread? Of course, he's actually on the run from Saul, and he's starving. So he ends up there is no bread except for the showbread, which is supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. He ends up eating that, which he ought not do. He also lies. The sword of Goliath is there, and so David says, well, I was sent on the king's business so suddenly in such haste that I didn't think I didn't have time to grab some weapon to take with me. So can I have this? So he lies. Ultimately ends up leaving there, continuing on his flight. And it just so happens that one of Saul's servants, a man named Doeg the Edomite, sees this. He's there as well. In between, so Doeg ultimately ends up going back to Saul, telling him what happened, and then Saul orders the execution of Ahimelech and all the other priests at Nob at Doeg's hands. So David, in a roundabout sort of way, is responsible for all of their being slaughtered. But between those two things, between his fleeing Nob and Saul ordering Doeg to come back and slay Ahimelech for helping David, right? That's the crime for which he's killed. He aided and abetted David. David flees to Philistine territory, and he's going to present himself to the king Achish in Gath. But David, rightly so, I think, ends up becoming afraid once he's there, because it's pointed out to the king, this is David who has slain so many of our people, right? Goliath chief among them. And David is notorious for having slain a lot of Philistines, so he goes and he flees to their territory, I think seeking refuge there. When he gets there, he finds out, oh, wait a minute, maybe they're not too thrilled to have me here, since I've killed so many of their people. And so instead, when he comes before the king, he feigns madness, right? He starts drooling and acting like a lunatic. And this is what it's referring to in the superscript when it says, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, or again, Achish, who drove him away and he departed. So once the king sees this man who seems to be a raving madman, he drives him away, and as the superscription says, he departed. He goes on and continues his flight from Saul. So it's that circumstance to which the composition of this psalm is attributed. Again, whether it's at the time that it's happening, which, like I said, doesn't there's so much going on there, and it doesn't make sense, especially the kind of thought that goes into the psalm. I'm with Brother Waycaster. If that is indeed the occasion, I suspect it's after the fact, and he's reflecting back upon it. A simple outline, alliterated as usual. Starts out with praise. Verses 1 through, and again, this is typical, of this type of song. Starts out with praise, the first three verses. Verses 4 through 10, the bulk of it, or at least of these sections, the bulk of it, not the entire psalm, but he talks about provisions, right? God's having provided for him. Verses 11 through 14, he speaks of precepts. Verses 15 through 18, God's providence, and then in 19 through 22, it finishes off, as many psalms do, discussing the idea of protection. And Brother Waycaster notes here also, Spurgeon, a renowned commentator on psalms, suggests that the psalm is divided, that you kind of have two trains of thought here, with a hymn up to verse 10, and then a division between 10 and 11, and then a sermon for the last part of it. So you can kind of look for that as well as we work our way through and see if just looking at 10 and 11 alone, you can kind of see a bit of a shift there, just with the language and the invitation that so obviously starts out in verse 11. But anyway, we will go through making some observations along the way. So David writes, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. Magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together." So, in every circumstances, whatever the situation, that might arise. And again, it's attributed to a particularly harrowing situation in David's life. He is going to continually be praising the Lord. His soul shall boast in the Lord, certainly not in himself, and which makes him humble, right? He's not going to magnify his own self, but rather the Lord. Magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. And it is interesting if, again, the particular circumstance to which this psalm is attributed, right? He's on the run from Saul. The reason he's in Gath in the first place, the whole reason he's presenting himself to Achish, is because he's had to further slay after lying to the priest, eating the showbread, taking the sword, and then, whether he knows it or not, getting them all killed in the process. So certainly, as he's doing all this, he continues to trust in the Lord. But it's like I said, in the heat of the moment, he's not making the best choices. I guess is what I would say. Lying to the priest, going to his mortal enemies, and then when he realizes that might have not been the best idea, acting like a raving lunatic, so they'll be disgusted and send him away, which is what happened. So again, reflecting back upon it, he may say something like this, offering praise to the Lord in the heat of a situation like that. It to me seems oddly out of place. But continuing on in verse 4, all the way down through 10, as he talks about the provisions, he says, I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. And that certainly fits. I mean, that's the case. These various flights that he has from Saul, because it was always back and forth with David and Saul. Saul would fly into a rage. He would seek to kill David. They would eventually come back to some understanding again. Saul, would be like, "Oh, David, you're the best. I love you. Come back." And David does, and then inevitably something else happens. Saul flies into an insane rage again. David flees again. But in all these circumstances that David is fleeing, he always has this sense of that it is God that's delivering him through it all. So verse 4, I would say fits. They looked unto him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. Speaking here now, if you're like me, you're wondering who are they? Those who accompanied David, right? So not necessarily on his own. He has an entourage with him, so to speak. Although you certainly don't read of that in 1 Samuel 21. But those who were with him. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. Again, it fits. He's in a terrible circumstance, and he manages to escape it through God's good graces. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. And here in verse 8, you have an interesting invitation. I like this particular thought. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. So he invites the reader. It's somewhat similar, I think of in John, if I'm not mistaken. It's where you have individuals who begin to realize that they had been following after John the Baptist, but now they realize the one that John had said would come has come. Christ is here. He's the one that you should follow. You have Andrew who discovers him and goes to his brother Peter and says, come and see. And you find that particular phrase used several times there in the 2nd chapter of John. Come and see, come and see. As someone would discover him, and then they would go find someone else, right? Their brother Peter, other friends who were invited to come. But there's that idea in that repetitive phrase, come and see. I can tell you about it, certainly, but it's better if you come and see for yourself, right? Come and look. And that's the invitation that you have from the psalmist. Taste and see that the Lord is good. You can take the psalmist's word for it, or you can try it for yourself, and that is so much better. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him, right? Come and see for yourself. and you're going to be blessed if you put your trust in the same place that I do. Fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. Right, so a similar thought to what you find in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:33. The Lord provides for the things that we need in this life. It may not always be, his people may not always find themselves in the lap of luxury, kind of like we discussed the week before last, if I'm not mistaken. He has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. He doesn't give us all things. He speaks of the necessities of life, right? Give us this day our daily bread, as the Lord put it in the model prayer. There is no want to them that fear him. Put your trust in him. You'll have what you need, but, again, written by a man, either at the time or reflecting back upon it, according to the superscription, who was in dire straits fleeing for his life. And yet he can certainly save us. Now, verse 10, again, going back to what we noted earlier in the introduction, potentially kind of the closing frame of this initial part of the psalm. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. The young lions, you may think of people who in the world who put their faith, their trust, in their own ability, particularly if they're young, strong, they're in the prime of life. They don't necessarily see want or need. It's kind of like a young person who thinks, everything's always going to be good. I'm invincible. I don't need anything or anyone. So I think he kind of uses that kind of a picture. Someone who's putting their trust in themselves. They're ultimately going to end up lacking and suffering hunger. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. But they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. Right? Put your trust in the Lord. In other words. Now, continuing on, that wraps up this idea of provisions. Verses 4 through 10. He continues on verses 11 through 14, offering some precepts. And again, as Spurgeon noted, potentially starting here and then running through the rest of the psalm, a bit of a change in the tone and the train of thought. Come, ye children, hearken unto me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Sounds a lot like Proverbs chapter 1. What man is he that desireth life and loveth many days, that he may... Or what man is he that desireth life and loveth many days, that he may see good? It's everyone, right? What man is this? That's every man. Who doesn't want that? So if you do, then here's what he offers. Keep thy tongue from evil, and thy lips from speaking guile. Right? In other words, saying wicked things you ought not to say, speaking truth rather than lies, guarding your tongue. Depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. And this incidentally is quoted. It's in 1 Peter 3, 10 through 12, this particular section of Psalm 34. So Peter reiterates it in the New Testament. I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. If you want to have life, you want to have many days, in other words, you want to have a peaceful, prosperous life, live to a good old age, so that you may see good, right, rather than misery, then here's what you do, right? Live the kind of life that befits one who would seek to follow after God. Mind your tongue, mind your manners, mind the conduct of your life. And it's perhaps easier said than done, but some very basic precepts. Live the right kind of life. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous; his ears are open unto their cry. But it's kind of implied. 16 is a contrast to 15. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. Right. So that and there's this age-old debate. Whose prayers does God hear? Because we find in umpteen different places in Scripture that God hears the prayer of the righteous. He doesn't hear the prayer of the lost, of the sinful, etc. And this is just one more place here in Psalm 34, 15, and 16 that captures that thought. There are umpteen others. But what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that he literally doesn't hear it unless it's coming from one of his people, from a righteous person, from a saint, from one of his children? He literally doesn't hear it, or does it mean that he ignores it? Right, that he can hear it, but he chooses to disregard it. That debate goes around and around and around. I've heard some say, that I guess one take on that is, God does not hear the prayers of the sinners, of the lost, those who are not His people, unless that prayer is that they might come to an understanding of the truth. Right? If they're praying that they want to seek after Him, they're looking for truth. Then in that instance, He'll hear, and He'll by providence find a way for that to happen, or make a way for that to happen. I don't know, but I've heard a number of people espouse that idea. But I think the idea here is, and in other places, if you are a righteous person, you're doing right, you're seeking to live, to follow after God, as David did, despite his missteps, like the one in 1 Samuel 21, then God will not turn away from you. He will hear your prayer. His ears are open. The wicked, he isn't going to hear. Again, literally, or in the sense of being amenable to entertain their petitions. Either way, I don't know that it really matters. Continuing verse 17, the righteous cry of the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles. Again, David could say this on numerous occasions, not just the one to which the Psalms attributed. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Verse 18 makes me think of the very first beatitude in Matthew 5, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. I believe that's exactly what he means when he says, the Lord is nigh to them that are of a broken heart, saveth those of a contrite spirit, those who are humble, who recognize the need that they have. They're not boastful. They're not puffed up. You might also think of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, right? The Pharisee who's thankful that he's not like this wretched old sinner over here, this publican, this tax collector. Thank goodness God, I'm glad I'm so great. I'm glad I'm not like this guy over here. The publican, meanwhile, is there on the floor, wailing and beating his breast, saying, God, have mercy upon me, the sinner. Again, verse 18, that's precisely the idea. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. Yet again, David, perfect example. You would be hard-pressed to find an individual, I think, in Scripture who suffered more afflictions than David. Certainly in the New Testament, Paul comes to mind. But again, David just, one thing after another throughout his life story. Challenges that would certainly have broken or destroyed many a lesser man, certainly one who hasn't put his trust in the Lord as David did. But again, the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. Right? This is what's ultimately going to come of them. And I think it's similar, but not exactly the same. Going back to verse 10, right? Ultimately, the wicked, those that hate the righteous, are going to get what's coming to them. Kind of like the young lions, right? Who lack and suffer hunger. Maybe not right away, but sooner or later, it's going to happen. That first part of the verse makes me think of the saying, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Evil will slay the wicked. They're going to die the way they live, as a result of the way that they live. They that hate the righteous shall be desolate. But it's contrasted in the very final verse. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Which is, a lyric to a hymn that we sometimes sing them, that none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants. He buys them back. They're his right there. And if they trust in Him, they need not worry. They're not going to meet the same fate as those who live in wickedness, who hate the righteous, and who spurn God's will. All right, so that is Psalm 34. All in all, relatively typical as Psalms go in terms of the content. The one thing that makes it stand out is this, to me at least, is the superscription and the unusual circumstance that it is attached to, which we'll be coming to in the not-too-distant future in our Sunday morning class, making our way through 1 Samuel. But anyway, that is Psalm 34. Lord willing, we will continue next time with Psalm 35. Thank you all very much for your kind attention.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams, in my darkest hour. You are the Lord of all I am, so won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord, 'cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams, in my darkest hour. You are the Lord of all I am, so won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams, in my darkest hour. You are the Lord of all I am, so won't you reign in me again? You are the Lord of all I am, so won't you reign in